What we're going to look at in this chapter are the concepts of attachment and detachment, and we're also going to look at splitting and welding vertices. Attachment and detachment is only used on gross objects. In other words, scene nodes, things like this teapot that you can see here, this cylinder that you can see here, and these planes. If you want to combine two objects together, then you have to attach them together. After you've combined those objects, if you want to then break them apart to form two separate objects again, then you have to detach them. So as you can imagine, these are quite common things that you might need to do whilst modeling. Welding and splitting is a similar concept, except it's at the sub-object level. Let's say, for instance, we took these two planes and we attached them together. Then we might want to get the vertices that we have in this area here and actually attach those together, and that's called welding. And then later on in the modeling process, we may need to then break those vertices apart. And when we take one vertex and we turn it into two, we call that splitting. So let's have a look at how these concepts work now. We'll start off by making sure that we have an editable mesh. And in this case, we've got this teapot. And what we're going to do is we're going to attach this teapot to this cylinder and to these planes. And we're just going to form one object. But first we'll just attach the teapot to the cylinder. So if you go up to Edit Geometry, Rollout, Attach, just click on that, and then you can pick the objects from the scene that you actually want to attach. And let me explain what it's going to do when it does this. It's going to do a number of things. Firstly, it's going to convert the cylinder into an editable mesh. Then it's going to take the mesh definition, which is inside that mesh node, and it's going to attach those elements. It's going to merge them into the mesh definition of the teapot. And then once it's done that, there's no need anymore for the cylinder 01 transform node. It's got no geometry attached to it anymore, and it then basically gets deleted from the scene. So at that point, you lose the cylinder 01 object, but you then attach all this geometry to the teapot, and they basically become one object, and they keep the name teapot 01. So let me just do that. And there you go. All of those things just happen in that instant there. Got converted into an editable mesh, mesh got merged into the teapot's mesh, and the node was deleted from the scene. Now we don't have the cylinder anymore, but what we do have left is the mesh definition of the cylinder, and it's attached. It's basically merged into the mesh definition of this teapot. Let's try doing the same thing over here with these planes. I'll just convert this plane into an editable mesh. And now I'm just going to go up to the attach button. Or I can use attach list. Let me just show you that. With attach list, it's basically, instead of picking from the scene, you can use this list of scene objects. So I'm just going to choose the other plane, and I'm going to say attach. And again, the same process just took place. The object was converted, merged, and then the transform node was deleted. And basically, you lost that object from the scene, but you kept its mesh. So now we have two objects. We've got plane 2, and over here we've got teapot 1. I'll just change the color to here, just to show you that you've got these two separate objects. And if I wanted to now, I could attach this object to this object, or this object to this object. And obviously, whichever object you have selected when you do the attach is the object that you keep, and the object that you pick is the object that actually disappears from the scene. So that basically covers attachment, and you can do the same thing with a number of different geometry types. For instance, if you wanted to do the same thing with an editable poly, it works in basically exactly the same way. So let's move on to the topic of detachment. Detachment works in a pretty similar manner, but it's a little bit more complex. If we go into the sub-object mode of, let's say, these planes here, and we select some, let's say, some vertices, you'll see if we go up to edit geometry, we've got the option to detach. And when we click on detach, it comes up with this dialog box. And the reason for that is that we can detach in two different ways. We can either detach the current selection to a new object. In other words, that creates a new scene object, gets the elements that you have selected, and then puts those into that new object. Or you can detach to a different element. And that will then actually break what you currently have selected apart and put it into a different element in the scene. This is something that we hit on in chapter 1. So I'm just going to cancel that for now. And I'm going to show you it in maybe a little bit more of a sort of understandable way by first looking at elements. Elements, as we said in chapter 1, are areas of a mesh which are contiguous, where basically all the vertices are connected together, all the vertices and edges. So if I click on elements here, you can see that we've got two separate elements. But if I click on some faces, let's say some polygons here, and then I say detach, again, we have the option of detaching to a different object or detaching to an element. In this case, I'm going to say detach to an element. And what it's going to do at that point is it's going to break apart the vertices that we have along this edge here. And it's also going to break apart the edges. And basically, where you had one edge, you're going to have two. Where you had one vertex, you're going to have two vertices. So if I say OK, you don't actually see any difference. There's no visible difference anyway. But if I click off here and I go to element, and now I click on here, we've got one element, two elements, three elements. So now we have three elements, whereas before we only had two. And that's because we took those faces and we detached them off into their own element. And when we did that, it broke that edge along here. It split those edges. So if I grab this element and move it, you can see that these faces are no longer attached together via their shared vertices and edges. So I'll just undo that to put it back to where it was. Let's see what happens when we do the same thing with some vertices. Let's grab these vertices here. I'm just going to select all of these and go to detach. And I don't want to detach to a different object. I'm going to detach to an element and I'm going to say OK. And now I'm going to go up to elements and select. And again, you can see that we have a new element. But you can see that in this case, what's happened is all of the faces that had vertices that were used in the selection, they have also been detached into the new element. So we didn't actually detach just the vertices off into a new element. We also detached the edges that were associated with them and all the faces that were also associated with them. So that may seem a little bit strange, you know, but if you look at here, you'll see that this face uses this vertex and this vertex. This face just uses this vertex. But even though it's just one vertex, it still has to be detached into the new element. Same here, and same here. So that does actually make perfect sense if you think about it. If we do the same thing with edges, you'll see that you don't have the option. If we go to faces, you can see that we do actually have the detach option. So let's say we wanted to take this, let's say this face here. We can say detach to element, OK. And then you can see that it's actually broken that apart there. It's now a separate element. And that's because it doesn't share its vertices with anything around it. So there you go. That's basically how detaching to an element works. But if we wanted to detach to an object, that's equally just as easy. Let's go to this object and go into this object here. Let's say, for instance, we wanted to break off the spout. Well, the spout is an element because it's not attached to the body. None of the vertices are shared with the body. The body's its own element, the lid is, and the handle. So we can select the spout of the teapot, and what we can do now is we can go to detach. We'll turn off detach to element. Then we have the option to say what the name of the object is. So let's call it, I think the obvious name would be spout. Say OK. And now if we come out of sub-object mode, you'll find that we have another object which is called spout01. So that's perfectly logical. We could do the same thing with this object here. We could go back in here, pick any of the elements that you want to. Let's say this one, detach, and we'll call this one, let's say fragment. OK that. And now you'll find that we have a separate object here called fragment, as you can see. If we go up to the list here of objects in the scene, we've got fragment, plane, spout, and teapot. And if I wanted to, I could attach all of these objects together. Let's try doing that now. Attach list. Say all. Attach. So there we are. We've got just one object, which is called teapot01. And if we go into that object and we click on elements, you can see that our elements are still intact. And that's because these objects are not attached together by shared vertices in any way. So there you go. I think you got a pretty good grasp now on attaching, detaching to an element, and also detaching to an object. you might be wondering, how do you get objects to become one element again? Well, for that to happen, they have to share vertices. At the moment, these do not share vertices. These vertices are unique to this object, and this is split off from here also, and this object is split off from here. Now, the way you bring these two objects together so they become one element is you basically just weld any of these vertices along here. So let's just zoom in here on a vertex, zoom out a little bit. And if I click here, there are two vertices at this point. You can't see them, but they're, basically occupying the same space. You can see that I can move this vertex over here, and I can move this vertex over here. So you can see there are actually two separate vertices at those points. What I need to do is I need to bring these vertices together so they become one vertex, and that's called welding. And there are actually two different ways that you can weld vertices together. One is an automated system, which is great when you have thousands of vertices which share the same point in space and you want to weld them together so they merge into one vertex. The other method is more explicit. You have to actually get involved and do it by hand. And they're basically designed for two different situations. One where you're kind of hand modeling and you want to attach vertices together to make them into one. And one is where, as I said, you've got a sort of mass merge that you have to do, and therefore some kind of proximity test is used. So let's have a look at these two now. I'm going to zoom in here. And the first method I'm going to use is the proximity test, and it's over here. You can see we've got this weld panel here. So I'm going to go for selected, and I'm going to put this threshold down first. This is in scene units, so let me put this really low. You can see no vertices within threshold, so that's perfectly normal. These vertices are basically further apart than this value here stipulates, so let's increase this value. Selected, still too far apart. Let's put up a little bit more. There you go. So we got the threshold right. They were basically, something like within 2.5 units of each other. But you can see one of the issues with this system is that it basically finds the common center of the two and then creates one vertex at that point. It may not be obvious that it is one vertex, but if I click now and click here and move this around, you can see that I've only selected one vertex and these edges are now sharing that one vertex. Let me just undo that, split them apart again. The other method is to use a target. So for that, we can basically say target. And now when I drag this over towards this other vertex, when it gets within a certain threshold, it should change to this target cursor. And if we leave go when the cursor is active, it gets welded to that vertex there. Let me just undo that. You can also change the threshold of that range that the cursor has to be near to by using this value here. So you can actually make it larger. So let's say we said 24. Now when I get within 24 pixels of that vertex, you can see it becomes active. And then I can just leave go and it gets welded to it. So depending on the circumstance, you might want to use one system or the other. If you've got a circumstance where, you've got some kind of physical gap like we have here, let me just move this here. If you've got, oops, we've actually got target on, so it actually immediately welded it back together. So if we just move this here and zoom out, if you've got this kind of situation where you've got physically separated vertices over quite a large area and you need to stitch them together again, then you could try using target. You can just turn that on, move it into position, and then those vertices get welded together again. If you've got vertices which are already basically coincident, as you can see here, you can try using the threshold method. So for that, you just need to select all the vertices that you want to attempt to weld, set a threshold that you think is big enough. Now in this case, we could actually use a much smaller threshold than this because they're basically coincident. We could use something like that. And then click on selected, and now those vertices should have become welded together. So where there were two vertices, you now have one. If I move this, you can see that's welded. You can see that's welded also. And now because these vertices are shared, you should find that if you go into element mode and click, you can see that now, whereas this was two elements before, it's now become one element, as you can see. If we click on here, we can see that we've got three separate elements. So we can just select the vertices, click on weld, and now you should find that you've now just got two elements. And we could also select along here and weld that together. And now we've just got one element there. And we could also weld these vertices together here. Now, if we wanted to have a perfect join, we could actually just move this element over here and then weld. Or we could accept that some kind of popping is going to take place. They're going to share a coincident position between each other, and we could just use this system. I know that if I click on selected here, it's not going to be big enough. So let's try increasing this value. I think probably something like 3 would be needed here, maybe. There we go. So now these are welded together, and if we go to element, you can see that now you only have one element. We've actually attached these together, and now we have one contiguous surface, and it's only one element there. So let's explore a little bit further. I'm going to come out of this object, and what I'm going to try and do now is I'm going to try and detach the different parts of the cylinder. I'm going to try and remove the base from the sides and the top. So that's easy enough to do. We can just go into polygon mode, and then just click on here, and you can see that we've selected the top of the cylinder. Now I can quite easily go up to detach it to an element, okay. Come down here, choose the bottom part, and this is actually attached. Let me just show you that. We can't actually move that without moving the sides because they're sharing the vertices along the edge here. And now I can say detach to element, okay. And now you'll find that if you grab these, you can move them, and as you can see, they're now separate elements. We've broken the vertices apart here. We've basically increased the number of vertices in the object as well. So let me just put those back into place. And now if I wanted to, I could basically attach these elements back together again. And all that needs is for a couple of shared vertices. So to have a bridge here face, so that, you know, it shares an edge. So that would form one element. So we'll just select these and we'll say weld selected. And as you can see now, if I go to check, you can see now that it's actually just one object again. Or rather, I should say one element. And let's finish off here by looking at breaking things apart in a slightly different way. For that, I'm just going to get rid of these elements. I'm just going to select this element, press delete, delete, and delete. It just leaves us with this teapot here. And what I'm going to do now is, if I go into polygon mode, you can see that if you look over here, we have an option to explode. It sounds very dramatic, but really what you're talking about there is actually breaking the object up into multiple polygons. And you can do that on an element level, or you can also break the object up into multiple objects. So let's have a look at that working now. We'll select all the faces. And if I choose an angle threshold, this is the angle threshold between all the different polygons here. Let's say we go for an angle threshold of 0, and we say explode to objects. You can see it's got the option here. You can choose the name, and then let's say OK. What you'll find is now that if you look at your scene, we'll come out of sub-object mode. You look at your scene, you've got a lot of different objects. We've got all these, 1024 different objects. And each one of those is a separate object. We can click on any one of them, and every single polygon that was part of that teapot is now a separate object. And it's not even every polygon, it's actually every face, as you can see. I can move them apart here just by clicking on them and moving them around. That is actually, it's pretty crazy. You may not really need that very often, but the option is always there. If you need to break objects apart in that way, then you can do so. Now, in this case, I chose an angle threshold of 0, which means that it breaks it down into the individual faces. If we wanted to combine it all back together again, we could just attach it. So we'll just go back up here, choose teapot 01, select that, attach list, choose all of the objects in the scene. We know that we've only got basically these objects which are basically the faces of the original teapot. We'll say attach, and now we have one object which is made up from all of those faces. But if we go in here and we select any of the faces, you'll see that they're still separate. Basically, every single face in this teapot is now a separate element. We can find that, but if we go to elements and click, you can see that we've got a lot of different elements in this teapot. Every single face is actually a separate element there. But of course we know that if we can get them to share their vertices again, then we'll get a more manageable group of elements. So let's go to vertices. We'll choose all the vertices in the object. We're going to choose a very small threshold for the weld in this case. And that's because if we used a large threshold, well, let's see what happens. As you can see, it's actually welded a lot of vertices together that really weren't necessary, and it's really munged up the object. Let me just press Ctrl Z to undo that. We'll choose a smaller threshold. And again, this is probably too big. Let's try that. Yeah, you can see it's actually broken some areas here. So you can see that in this case, we need to pick a really, really small threshold, just something which is enough to get us back to the coincident vertices being welded. So let's actually, before we do that, let me just right click on the object and look at properties. And you can see here we've got a count of the elements in the object. It's got 3040 vertices and it's got 1024 faces. So you can see it's actually got 3 times as many vertices as it has faces, which makes sense because for every face we have 3 vertices. So that's why we've got 3 times as many vertices in the scene as we have faces. But normally when we have a mesh, we have much fewer vertices than faces because usually the faces share the vertices. So let's try and get back to that kind of normal state of play. We've got them all selected. Let's click on here. I think that was okay. Let me just zoom in and check. Let's just undo that. Selected. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. And if we zoom out now, we can test this by selecting elements. So let's just, yeah, there's the spout, there's the body, there's the lid, and there's the handle again. And if we go out of sub-object mode and look at the properties, you can see now that we have 529 vertices because they've been merged and consolidated. And we can see that we have 992 faces. So when we did that weld there, we actually lost some faces. So we should have actually chosen a smaller threshold. Otherwise, you know, we wouldn't have lost those faces there. And now if we go back into sub-object mode, select all of the faces again, and we say explode, let's try a value of 0.3, very small angle. That should obviously preserve the polygons. It shouldn't split it apart into individual faces. So let's try hitting explode, and it's going to explode it to objects. So we'll say OK, and then it takes a few seconds, and then we'll just go out of sub-object mode, and you can see that now we've actually broken it apart into individual faces. Let me just undo that a few times. And now we can go back into sub-object mode again, select all the faces, and this time I'm going to use quite a big angle. Let's say, there we go, something like 8 degrees, explode, and this time I'm actually going to explode into elements. So let's just explode that into elements. And there you go, you can see it's exploded into a lot of different elements there. Just deselect, go into sub-object element mode, select, and you can see now that you've got all of these different elements making up the object. And it's just basically broken it apart based on the angle threshold between different groups of polygons. And I think that basically covers it. I think you know now that you can attach 2 objects together. You can detach objects and break them apart again. You can detach subparts of an object into different elements, which basically breaks apart the shared vertices within that object. You can also combine elements by welding together their vertices, and as long as they share an edge, then they'll become one element. And we've found that you can actually break an object apart in a kind of procedural way by using the explode tool. And it's very, very freeform. It's very, very fluid. You can attach objects, detach them, get the polygons from one object, attach them to another object, weld them, and stitch things together. And it's very, very freeform and fast and easy to use. You can see you've got the tools there to work with. You can weld in a kind of procedural way by using the selected system and using the radius value to decide what vertices will weld together. Or you can use the target system where you manually pick vertices and drag them, and when they get within the range of another object, the pixel range, then you can actually drop it and it'll attach those 2 vertices together. And the vertex that you actually drop will move over and attach itself to the vertex that you've moved it within range of. They're both perfectly valid systems and useful in different circumstances. And there is one other way of breaking objects apart, and that actually comes into play with the editable poly, and that's the ability to split edges. So I'll just very quickly show you that. If we, let's say, convert to editable poly, We'll go into sub-object mode, edge. What we can do now is we can say, let me just get rid of some of these objects actually. I'm just going to, actually we've broken up into multiple elements, so let me just weld all this stuff back together again. Let's choose weld threshold, we'll just put a small value. And you can see that in Edit Poly it's actually interactive. You can see, which is very cool. Much nicer than in Edit Mesh. So let's just choose a value which is good. It's okay. You can see it shows you the vertex count before and after. We'll just okay that. And now I'm going to select these elements and delete them, because I don't actually need them for this, what I'm just about to show you. But what we can do now is we can select this edge. I'm going to select it all the way around, and I'm going to go to here, click on split, and now you'll find that if you go to elements and click here, you've got one element, and here you've got another element. It's actually split the edge all the way around there and effectively created two lots of vertices and edges at that point. If you select an edge which is in the middle of an area, for instance, if we, let me just move this up here to make this clearer. So if we select this edge here and we say split, then it's not going to actually work, because there's no way it can break just the vertices of this edge apart at the ends here, because those vertices are also used by this edge here, so that isn't going to work. But if we go to this edge here and say split, that will actually work, because we've got a vertex here which isn't shared with anything, and you'll find now that that's actually split apart. But if we go down here, you'll find that that wasn't split apart. Remember we just split that edge? Well, that didn't work because, as I said, it was sharing vertices. So as you can see, it's very easy in Edit Poly to get lines, you know, runs of edges, like here, let's say, and let's say here. Let's click on loop. This is something we'll be looking at later on in this DVD. Loop then selects that run of edges. We can then say split. And now you can see that we've actually split this mesh along those edge lines. And now if I go in and just select some of these edges, sorry, some of these faces, polys here, I can just pull that around and you can see that it's actually split all the way along there. And the reason why it was actually one element there is because it's actually not split along a couple of the edges there. And that must be because of back facing, I would guess. But basically you can see inside there, there's the seam. It's actually split along here and here. So that's another way that you can actually break objects apart, in Edit Poly at least, by selecting edges and then using the split tool. Okay, so we know about attaching, detaching, welding, splitting, and exploding. So let's move on.